President Trump is about to sell Turkey F-35s, challenging Israel's air superiority in the region. And Hamas finally relinquishes control to the government in Gaza. Can we trust them? This is the Deep Dive. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. As we mark 6 months since the January 8th and 9th massacre in Iran, and we reside in a very uncertain time where we're not sure where the negotiations are leading. Does Trump want to even continue? Is he getting favorable terms against the regime? We're not entirely sure. But while the world's focus and attention is on that, there are two arenas that are silently putting pressure on Israel, and if we don't pay attention to them now, we can find ourselves in a very unfavorable position. These are Turkey and Gaza. At the time of recording, President Trump is currently in Turkey for a NATO summit and is set to meet with President Erdogan. The meeting is set to discuss strategy, relationship between the two, and most importantly, the potential sale of the F-35 combat jet. If this sale is to go through, it would completely shift Turkey's influence in the region and redistribute how the powers are balanced, as well as threaten Israel's air superiority, of which it is famously known for. Separately, Turkey's close relationship to the US, as well as its membership with NATO and the Board of Peace, means that it can increase its influence on Israel's decisions in the Gaza Strip. To explore this more, we're joined by Or Horvitz, a senior fellow of the JPPI and the lead of the American program, as well as a commentator and consultant on geostrategic development and an ex-IDI officer. Or Horvitz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jake.
So, obviously in Israel, all eyes are on Iran and how, the deal is going and how the negotiations are going. And maybe we could touch a bit on that. And there's also a lot of internal political stuff that's been happening. Kind of on the sidelines, but just as important, and I think we want to keep a hand on the pulse on, is Turkey and Gaza. So, as we know this week, Trump is in Turkey. He's meeting with Erdogan. At the time of this filming, I think they're supposed to meet today. And amongst many other things, the hot topic issue that you see everywhere is the potential sale of F-35s. So, I want to hear your take about Turkey, about F-35s, about the paradigm shifts, all of it.
So usually when I try to understand Turkey or elaborate about this challenge, I used to say that it is not Abu Dhabi, but it is not Tehran as well. Turkey is something in the middle. On the one hand, a growing challenge. I just saw a poll that was conducted several months ago that stated that more than 96% of the Turkish are seeing Israel in a negative way, which says that the problem is not necessarily the leadership, but the problem is currently Turkey as a whole. And we know that Turkey has aspiration far beyond its border. And we know that Erdogan keeps stating how he loathing Zionism. And we've seen his supports for Hamas. So I think this is a growing challenge. But on the other hand, we need not to fall into the Iran analogy trap. Turkey is not Iran. I think that the US has plenty of leverage on it. Turkey wants to be part of the Western world as much as it wants to be part of the Middle East and part of the broader or the larger region. And I think it tells you a lot about the way you can leverage your pressure over Turkey. Another thing which is very important is that Turkey wants to be an actor in the Palestinian arena and in the Syrian arena. And in order to achieve its goal, it have to have some sorts of dialogue with Israel because Israel has direct effect on these arenas. And we need to take another factor into account, and that is we still have some sort of direct linkage or direct relationship with Turkey, which allows us to overcome confrontation or overcome crisis. We've seen what happened in Syria when both of our air force managed to find understanding and operate, I want to say together, but without getting into a direct confrontation. So I think we are seeing a growing challenge and we are seeing a diverge of interest between Israel and the US regarding the F-35 sales, but also regarding the other aspects of Turkey. But it does not entail that we have to see Turkey as the next Iran and that direct confrontation is inevitable. I generally don't think that it is an accurate observation.
So I think it's safe to say that it's going to be the next Iran and it's going to try to encroach Israel and there's going to be an open conflict might be a very far distinct exaggeration. But I do feel that does leave us with a lot of in between. I don't think it's realistic to say that even with all these, this leverage in play and Turkey wanting to be part of the West and Turkey being a NATO member, Obviously, I don't think Turkey is going to be as amicable as, members of the Abraham Accords. So I wonder what this leverage actually looks like, because if it's not just a government problem, if the people of Turkey vehemently disapprove of Israel and Zionism, I don't understand how the low-level baseline partnership can expand into a way where it will it will kind of like flourish negotiations, or kind of come into play where a way where it doesn't impede Israel where we don't want it to.
So I think you're spot on. We should not hope for the resumption of the strategic relations that we once had with Turkey in the late 90s. That probably won't happen in the upcoming years and perhaps even decades. But I'm hearing growing sentiments within the Israeli decision makers and within the Israeli society that sees Turkey, as a direct threat to Israel. And I think that Turkey does pose a direct threat on several fronts, but in the end, it is much different country than Iran is. And I think that you can influence the way it behaves through the corridors of Washington, through the European Union, through the direct relations that we have with Turkey, but also through the deterrence that we have in the region. So I think that you have some leverages over Turkey that will prevent it from becoming this direct and major threat. But on the other hand, we need to understand that Turkey is fundamentally different than what it used to be in the late 90s, and that Turkey wants to be a regional superpower, and may I dare even a global superpower. So we need to understand that. And whenever you have superpower that compete over dominance, there is chances for crisis and confrontation. And we need to find almost any way possible to avert this. And also think that we can see some opportunities. For example, we know that in the past, when we tried to work hard with our friends in Washington, we managed to reduce Hamas presence in Turkey. So I think you have room for influence over Turkey. Turkey does not want to be Iran. It does not want to be unilaterally isolated. It wants to be in a whole different spectrum. And I think it's possible with Turkey taking advantage, knowing that we won't have the same strategic partnership that we once had.
I'm curious how many people at the highest level who actually make the decisions have the same analysis as you and kind of view Turkey in this way, because it's kind of really easy to view Turkey as ultra hostile when they literally hosted, I would say, former Hamas leadership. I don't know about the current Hamas leadership, but like, Khania and such, they hosted them all the time. So are the people at the top level actually concerned and see Turkey as a threat? Or do they see it kind of in the same way that you do? And this is attempts more to like limit Turkey influence in Gaza, or like neighboring arenas and such.
I think that many people used to have my perception, but the last 2 years, I think, we've seen some changes within the regional landscape. First and foremost, more and more Israelis and more decision makers believe that Iran's stability is being shattered and that Iran axis is being weakened. And if the Iran axis will be weakened, perhaps even if this regime will be toppled in the upcoming years, then you'll see a new superpower rising. And that superpower will probably be Sunni rather than Shiite. So I think that many think that once Iran is being weakened, then the probability of Turkey becoming the new threat is becoming more imminent or more probable. So I think that perhaps I'm going into the minority point of view, but still, I think, and again, I don't see Turkey as a friend. I am well aware of the threat that it poses over Israel and over Israel interests, but we need to be very accurate in the way we portray Turkey, in the way we understand the challenges, and the way we understand the differences and similarities between Turkey and other threats that we have in the Middle East. But as a whole, I think that it is wise to assume that Turkey is a growing challenge to Israel in the upcoming year. That will be an accurate observation.
Over the past week, Netanyahu has interviewed with many foreign press outlets, and a lot of his heavy messaging has been about Turkey and the sale of F-35s. So a few things. Is this like the hot button issue in Israel right now, and Netanyahu is trying to do this to influence Trump? And what is the significance about the F-35 specifically? Meaning, is it like the principle of the paradigm of now Turkey has more regional influence? Or is it specifically the capabilities of the F-35 that poses not a threat, but like changes the leverage?
So I think first, it's very interesting to see that Prime Minister Netanyahu is taking advantage of the unique leverage that you have over Turkey, trying to influence it through Washington. So that is very interesting to see. Yes, I think it is a concern that the IAF aerial superiority in the region is being challenged, and it's not being challenged by our friends UAE or even by Saudi Arabia, but by Turkey. That is a growing challenge. But we also need to understand that Washington has its own calculations, and we need to be very smart on that. On the one hand, trying to challenge this trend of supporting or increasing the military support to Turkey, but on the other hand, understanding the growing challenge that we have in the US. We don't want to be portrayed as the one who are against US interests. So we need to find this delicate balance, and it is a very, very delicate task. We should not put 100% pressure on Washington in order to prevent it from allowing Turkey to join the F-35 program, even though it's a great challenge, because I think that the threat to the support, to the US support for Israel will be very, very grave, and we need to be very cautious in not to get into that.
I see. And then if we focus on Washington for a sec, what do you think is the main interest into why the US is pushing for this sale? Is it Trump's friendship with Erdogan? Is it trying to reshift dynamics within a NATO? Because obviously, the US has been kind of critical of the partnership with NATO since like in this term, and they're trying to reshuffle defense spending budgets and like all these other things. So is this part of that greater strategy, or like what's motivating the US to make this deal go through?
I think it's all of the above. Perhaps the most important thing is the personal connections that President Trump and Erdogan have, and we have to acknowledge that. So I think perhaps that's the most important thing. Turkey knows how to leverage its interest in the US as well. It has many influence over the decision makers in the US. It invested heavily on the US decision makers, US lobbyists, etc. So this is one thing that we need to take into account. Turkey is also an economical superhub, at least for a region in the region. And Turkey knows how to export arms. It has vast security and in the defense industries that it can export. It can collaborate quite effectively with the US because they work together in NATO. So I think that the US has many interests to do so. But on the other hand, I think that Turkey, unlike Israel, is not staunchly pro-American because it does work with other countries that are not necessarily directly aligned with the US. For example, its relations with Iran, its relations with Russia, its relation with China, and its supports for terror networks all across the region. So I think that Turkey is a very complicated country. And if I was President Trump, I would not have allowed it to be part of such an important and delicate process like the F-35 production. But again, the calculation in here is very, very complicated.
I see. I do want to pivot into Gaza, but there is a link to Turkey here. Like one of the questions that I wonder is, assuming the deal goes through and relations between the US and Turkey grow stronger and the influence of Turkey kind of grows, does Turkey have a way of kind of expanding its influence also in the Board of Peace and essentially helping dictate policy that in a way will kind of, force Israel to abide by it in regards to the Gaza Strip?
The answer, unfortunately, is yes. The fundamental problem that we have is that both Qatar and Turkey are strategic partners of the US. And when you look at what is happening or what can be unfolded in Gaza, then the probability of increased influence by Qatari Turkey is becoming much more evident. And that is a growing problem. We want international support and engagement in Gaza. We don't want it to be Qatar or Turkey. We want it to be, for example, UAE or Saudi Arabia or other countries. And Israeli interest, and I think this is very unequivocally blunt, Israel wants the lowest influence that Qatar and Turkey can have over Gaza. And I'm not sure that the US have the same point of view. And we need to work very hard in order to prevent them from influencing what happened in Gaza, because if we will allow them a growing presence in Gaza, then the probability of a growing influence by the Muslim Brotherhood movement will be much stronger. So we need to do almost everything in our power in order to prevent that. And I'm sure that if you'll have the same interview with MBZ of UAE, you will say the exact same thing. You don't want Muslim Brotherhood affiliates going around in Gaza and trying to influence what is going there.
So obviously this would be speculative, but what are some things that Israel can do to try to combat this growth and influence? Like, what does looking really hard look like?
So first, I think we need to offer alternatives. At the moment, unfortunately, Israel is being dragged into the board of peace and does not initiate its own peace initiative, if you like. And we need to combine those two efforts. At first, we need to move militarily in order to keep dismantling Hamas capability in Gaza Strip, because you have to do so as a precondition to every agreement that you want to have. But on the other hand, you want to bring moderate forces that are not Hamas and that are not Qatar and Turkey into Gaza Strip. And I think if you do those two things, on the one hand, going militarily against Hamas, but on the other hand, push moderate voices within the region towards Gaza Strip, then we might have a different outcome. Currently, and unfortunately, Israel is almost excluded from negotiating what is happening in Gaza. And that is very, very unfortunate. And I assume that if we'll continue to do so, we'll find ourselves with Gaza in worse shape 3 or 4 years ago.
I see. And this is, again, just speculation, but I am curious on your take before we get into the actual news in Gaza. Do you think it's very realistic that Israel could actually take some of these steps or make some of these efforts before elections, or is the government too focused on campaigning and figuring out this like blitz of legislation, and we're realistically not going to see any changes in Gaza until after elections are done?
Look, usually when people ask me about what is happening in Israel, I tend to tell them that perhaps I'm an Israeli, but I know much better on what is happening in the region and with our adversaries. But I think that at least on bringing the moderate forces towards Gaza, the probability is that we won't see anything of this up until the next elections, and hoping it will happen after the election. But regarding the military arm, I think it's possible. We need to keep pushing through on dismantling Hamas, whether it's in the 60% territory that we currently hold or the other 40%. We need to keep pushing forward, because this is, unfortunately, the only way to dismantle the remain military presence that Hamas still has. And as long as Hamas will still be there, then we won't have any opportunity for a different outcome. So at least for that issue, we can move forward up until September.
Mm-hmm. So doing a full pivot into Gaza, the kind of big story was that Hamas announced that it was disbanding its emergency government committee, which is kind of like the body that allows it to integrate into the governing body of Gaza. And they said that they would recognize the technocratic committee, the NCAG, and the NCAG said that they recognize Hamas's disbanding of the committee, and is essentially like a accepting symbolic transfer of the authority into this new authority. But Hamas also said they're not necessarily going to still give up all of their weapons. So is this the beginning of Hamas fully ceding its influence, or is this kind of just for show the next step in order to try to get things moving along?
I think it's only a charade. I think that Hamas will never give up on its arm without military force trying to take it away from them. And I think now they're trying to find an excuse in order for the international community to put the blame over Israel. And we need to be very wise on that. Perhaps the most important thing now is to work very hard in order to get from Mr. Meladenov the statement that the ones responsible for the failure of going forward towards an agreement is Hamas. And that is true. That is the case currently. So I think this is only a charade, and we need to expose this charade. Hamas will never give up its arm. By the way, I think that they are willing to give up their controlling over Gaza, but they never give up their arms, whether it's in Gaza Strip or in Judea Samaria. This is the very essence of their DNA. And if they'll give up their arms, they would basically give up their existence as a terror organization, as a Mukawama organization, if you will. And I don't see any future in which they will be able to do that.
So if that's a precondition that they'll almost never agree to, how is this going to end up playing out? Is Israel going to have to continue to do it forcefully? Or is the assumption going to be that eventually the ISF or some other body, or maybe the NCAG, will do it themselves to actually get Hamas to take over their arms? Or is this kind of going to be a precondition that the US or the Board of Peace is going to kind of push Israel to deal with? Like, here, they gave control of Gaza. Yes, they have arms, but they're not controlling anymore, and that's good enough, and we have to get things going.
I think that Hamas is not a partner for anything that is not being seen through the barrel of a gun. That is the unfortunate truth. Hamas is a vicious terror organization. It hasn't changed dramatically since October 7, even though its leadership have changed. And I don't see any scenario where you can have an agreement with them in which they are giving up their arms and in which they are allowing the rebuilding or reconstructing of Gaza Strip and allow both the Palestinians and the Israelis to try to build better future. I don't see any future that Hamas is part of this solution. Hamas is part of the problem. And if it's part of the problem, then the only way to deal with it is through military means. But on the other hand, we know that there are over 1 million Gazans who live there. Some of them supported staunchly Hamas on October 7 and prior to that. But we need to work hard in order to change their hearts and minds. As long as they won't go out of Gaza, and this is the now it's becoming increasingly clear that they are not going out of Gaza, then the only way to deal with them is to try to reduce their support over Hamas. And I think that after the devastation in Gaza that was made by the fact that Hamas built entrenched military facilities under rooftops and houses and schools and hospitals, I think Gazans are more and more inclined to understand that Hamas is part of the problem. And if you'll give them other alternatives, which are moderates, I think we might see a better future. But Hamas can be part of the solution. It's only part of the problem. And I think we need to acknowledge that before we are going any further in trying to find a solution for Gaza.
And we talked about the move as like a symbolic move in order to show that they're cooperating to not have to immediately give up the guns. But also importantly, we have to ask, by dissolving this committee, are they actually ceding control of Gaza, or are they still able to pull things behind the scene?
So it's interesting. I think that Hamas will want to hold control behind the scene, but I think that on some circumstances, they will be able to give up completely their control. Because the most important thing for them is the fact that they will still have arms. And Hamas is looking on the long term. And it genuinely believes that with Allah's support, with God's support, they will be able to overcome the current crisis that they are having and will build in the future as long as they have their mukarama, their terror networks, their genuinely and staunch belief. And they are willing to give some concession in the short term in order to get into the long term. So I think it might be possible. But again, the problem is not that they are ruling outside or beside the curtain. The main problem is that they will still have weapons. And if they'll still have weapons, then people will be afraid of them and they will be able to call the shots, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in the West Bank. And this is what we need to fight against. We need to fight against the military capabilities that allow this idea to proliferate across the Palestinian arena. If we won't be able to tackle that, then we are in a problem. And another thing which is very important, Jack, is the fact that after we killed Azzadin Haddad and Muhammad Uda, the remain leadership in Gaza is not that strong. So we might see another crack in the Hamas leadership, in its ability to hold power over the people of Gaza or perhaps the people of Judea and Samaria. So we need to work against those extremists within the Hamas movement, and I think it will allow us in more effective way to challenge the problem called Hamas in Gaza and in the West Bank.
As we said at the very beginning, that these developments kind of happened at a very weird time in the context of the greater picture of this very vague area, which is the Iran war ceasefire negotiation trifecta. No one really knows what's going on there. There were renewed strikes on Iranian ships and also on U.S. targets in the Gulf. And also internally in Israel politically, there's a lot of things happening. There's a blitz of trying to pass legislation and all these different coalitions forming and what have you. Would it be realistic for any of these to flourish into big developments? Or do we think that these two arenas, Turkey and Gaza, are going to mainly stay quiet because the US and Israel both kind of have their hands full?
It's interesting. I think that we have a growing probability that Israel will increase its military presence over Gaza or its military effort over Gaza because of the reason that I've stated. And because we have many limitations currently, both in the Lebanese arena for mostly good reasons and also in the Iranian arena. I'm not sure that whether it's with good reasons or not. So I am seeing growing probability that we will increase our military operations within Gaza, trying to increase the military presence that we have there until we reach the mile point of approximately 80%, which is, I think, the watershed moment in which we will have much more efficiency in dealing with the remained military presence in Gaza. But on the other hand, it's a major question because currently the IDF is overflowed with tasks and missions all across the region and all across the arena. So it will be very interesting to see how we'll be able to handle our priorities and trying to handle, in the end, the limited amount of troops that we have. But I think that we will see in the future a growing military presence in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. So you say that it's likely that we'll see an increased military presence, but again, in this time where elections are coming up, Iran, the negotiations are happening, and the US wants Israel to kind of not mess that process up. And as of right now, with the NATO summit, Turkey will potentially be having increased influence in the region. And with Turkey's increased influence and the Board of Peace and the ACG, the announcements, and they want things to keep rolling, it feels that a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles will be asserted onto Israel at the same time. Is the increased military presence in Gaza, aside from how likely it is that we'll see it, is that the most important thing that Israel can do right now? Or is there something crucial that Israel has to do before all this pressure falls on it?
So, no, I think we have more important priorities. First and foremost, trying to find a way to either export or dilute the remaining half a ton enriched uranium, 60%, that Iran has, a stockpile that is sitting there. We need to do everything in our power, whether it's through negotiation or whether it's through other means, in order to make sure that this stockpile will no longer be there, because this is the most prominent and direct threat to Israel interest, because it allows Iran, if it wants, to build nuclear bomb in the middle of the desert and to declare 7 months from now that they have made a nuclear experiment. So we can't allow it to happen, and I'm hoping that we are doing everything in our power in order to prevent that. The second priority is to try to reach an agreement with the state of Lebanon that will, on the one hand, will move us towards a pathway to a peace agreement, but will also increase the likelihood of demilitarized Hezbollah. I think this is the second most important priority, and for the first time in 30 years, I think it's possible, because Hezbollah is more isolated than ever, without the Syrian support, without most of the Lebanese people's support. So I think this is possible. I'm hoping we will achieve that. But the third priority, and it is still important, is to try to dismantle Hamas. And as I've mentioned, I don't see any way to do so without including military means and increasing our military presence there. So these are, in my perspective, the three priorities. On the other hand, we have a very strategic, important task for the long run, and that is to accelerate the instability of the regime, the Iranian regime, in order for it to be toppled in the upcoming years. I genuinely believe that the train has left the station, and that we need to work hard using not just kinetic, but other means as well, in order to accelerate the pace of the crumbling, if you will. And I think this is perhaps the most strategic mission that Israel can have for the upcoming future. And I generally hope that we are working very hard in the Kiryat and in our other headquarters in order to achieve that important mission.
It's hard to keep track of all of these things because they're so interwoven. But my last question, and I won't bind you to it, I just wanted to hear your thoughts. In two instances now, at least, we're currently in a place where Israel and US interests kind of diverge, whether it talks about the negotiation with Iran and also the issue of the sale of F-35s to Turkey. And as you said earlier, Israel has to kind of thread this needle where it wants to push its influence against it, but also not appear totally against the US and not respecting its decisions. Do you think Israel might have to concede on one of these issues, mainly I would guess on the issue of Turkey's influence, in order to show like it's a cooperating partner and have extra influence or a say in the negotiations of Iran? Or is Israel going to try to do everything it can in both of these issues?
So I think when you talk with your greatest ally, you need to take into account that you have to make some compromises. Unlike the stockpile of enriched uranium, I believe that the F-35, as bad as it is not something that you should fight for all across the end. And I think that our decision makers understand that. I don't know if you've heard the ambassador remarks and even the statement or the briefings that are being made to the Israeli media. Something like it's very bad, but it's not a disaster. So I think it gives you a hint of Israel's accurate strategy on this issue and the fact that it is focusing on other arenas. Again, we can have disagreements with the US. It is totally fine, and we need to understand when something is a necessity, like finding an answer to the enriched uranium, and when something is important, but not something that is a red line. And I think that currently the F-35 is not a red line, and Israel should make this discussions with the US without taking it into the public, without making the crisis becoming more evident or becoming public. I think this is very important. We need to focus on the things that matter, and when we have disagreement, we need to keep them in their room, because it is extremely important in order to preserve this vitally indispensable relation that we have in the US under this current, there is no other way to say it, under the current crisis that we are seeing in the US support towards Israel.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very sensitive, precarious position that Israel is currently in, and we'll have to see how it navigates itself. But I'm truly grateful that you were able to come here and clear some stuff up and kind of think of how we can navigate this ourselves mentally and how we can think about the different implications. So always great to have you, Or Horvitz, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's all we have for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that we covered a lot, and a lot of these issues are really interwoven with each other. And most importantly, I hope that you leave this episode with even more questions that you had before. We'll be back in the same place next week, but until then, make sure to stay up to date with the latest news at jpost.com.